I wear white today in the midst of Advent because this is also the feast day of John of the Cross, a 16th century Carmelite mystic, poet. Interestingly, his poetry deeply engaged with the mystical theology that he dealt with through his public life, that the poetry that he wrote remains today one of the great works of Spanish literature and is prized as such even by the non-believing, so to speak, academic world. John of the Cross. I'll return to John in just a moment. But first, a memory of Jesus' life with his disciples, captured in the Gospels, a memory in which Jesus encourages, instructs the disciples to always remember that they will do great works, and even greater, Jesus says, than he himself has done as an instrument of that gospel, that proclamation of good news, that they too will see the fruits of that proclamation in their lives. Mighty encouraging. And then he sticks in, so to speak, plan B, if you will, or plan A1 or whatever. And he says, and remember that you too will suffer as I for the sake of the gospel. Now, probably it was a little difficult for them to pick up on the second theme, but they did remember it, for it appears in the Gospels. And indeed, one would imagine that as they remembered it, the perpetrators of this negativity towards the gospel would be like those who were negative towards Jesus in his public ministry, and indeed in his last days in the temple. By what authority do you preach? Would be precisely those opposed to Jesus, those who were not like us, the little band of disciples of Jesus. That the threats and punishments coming to us would come from outside, from them. An imaginative look. But if we are honest, and here I now return momentarily to the biography of John of the Cross as an emblem and a memory that we need to always keep before us, that all too frequently in the history of the disciples of Jesus, it is not them way out there who are the enemies of the gospel. Often, sadly, it is the church. In the case of John of the Cross, he was a reformer, urged on by his friend and fellow reformer, Teresa of Avila, to reform the Carmelite order in the country of Spain in the latter part of the 16th century. And taking up that mantle as Teresa did amongst her women in the Carmelites, one of the things that happened strongly, powerfully to John was that he was persecuted. He was in prison. He was beaten. He was starved. and almost dead, he found a way to escape. And he found his way wonderfully to a convent of followers of Teresa who saved his life, fed him, built him up, denied to the authorities trying to find where John was, denied that he was with them, and then eventually led to his freedom, to his getting away from these dark forces. These forces of authority who claim to know and to need, so to speak, no reform, no new life. So it has been often in the history of the church and the history of disciples of Jesus. I note one other whose portrait is in the back, our present Pope Francis, who went through his own deep, dark crisis, his dark night of the soul, when as the provincial of the Jesuits, he too, modeling the priests and the elders in the temple, he stood silent as some of his Jesuits were led into captivity and into torture. He stood silent all too often as his fellow Argentinians were taken into captivity, and perhaps as many as 30,000 of them were thrown from planes into the South Atlantic to die. That silence that was characteristic of this provincial marked his life, pained him deeply. It was the opportunity for a conversion which took several years to work its way through Francis and turned him into a much better pastor, the pastor that he is today for the poor and the neglected. These experiences that happen in the church remind us within the gospel here, within the gospel that we hear, remind us of all those temptations that we face to silence, to standing with the priests and the elders, not willing, trusting, so to speak, our own authority, and not allowing the truth of the gospel to speak to us. It is also in the history of the church, deeply embedded, sometimes overlooked, that even those who are so frightfully silent have opportunities later on in their lives, as we say, to come to Jesus, to come to the truth, much as Francis did. Francis as Jorge Bergoglio. And let us pray not only for our Holy Father, but for all of us, hearers of the word, that we will be constantly open to the conversion that that word calls us to, and not be stuck in a smug silence.